So now I'm going to turn the program over to Ellen Meacham, who is a colleague of mine with the journalism school here. Ellen's been interested in Robert Kennedy's dramatic trip to Mississippi for years, and she's worked so hard to put today's program together. So, Ellen, it's all yours.
Thank you, Curtis. Well, good afternoon. I'm so glad y'all could join us today. In 1967, Robert Kennedy walked into dark, crumbling shacks in Mississippi. There he talked to parents struggling to feed their families and asked children what they had to eat. What he saw on that trip from Greenville to Clarksdale powerfully affected him. He would later call it an epiphany. It prompted him to urge Martin Luther King to bring poor people to Washington, and it shaped Kennedy's social conscience when he began his campaign for the presidency. But beyond the impact on Kennedy himself, this is a particularly rich topic for the Overby Center to explore for another reason. That's because it was through the words and lenses of the reporters who inevitably followed Kennedy that the nation also encountered those hungry children, at least for a brief moment. And the visit set in motion more coverage of the issue and efforts that ended with some significant reforms. But this discussion is not all about the past. The issue of poverty and the coverage it receives is still relevant today, with families nationwide struggling through a recession and 42% of the children in the Delta still living in poverty. To set up our discussion, we're going to just play a couple of minutes of a clip from the excellent documentary Eyes on the Prize about the Civil Rights Movement, and then I'll introduce our speakers and get to our discussion.
As war raged in Vietnam, the government's war on poverty suffered. In 1967, 1 in every 7 Americans lived below the poverty line. The question was how to regain the nation's attention.
I felt like the lowest thing on earth when I went to the welfare. I felt like they were all better than me, that they could walk all over me, which I got down on my hands and knees to them and begged them for coats and boots for these children at wintertime.
King was searching for national solutions. Groups were organizing at the grassroots level. The issues were jobs, welfare, the price of food.
Because we're trying to get everybody to stick together. One person just don't have to fight for themselves. All of us fight for each other.
In the South, poverty was even more widespread. Field hands earned as little as $3 a day. Civil rights activists looked for answers. A Senate committee was invited to Mississippi by a colleague of King's, Marian Wright.
They're starving. They're starving, and those who can get the bus fare to go north are trying to go north. But there's absolutely nothing for them to do. There's nowhere to go, and somebody must begin to respond to them.
We would think that all of us would be able to provide for some of our citizens living in this part of the country.
I tried to bring the senators down to Mississippi because I was trying to figure out ways of getting the country to see. I mean, we were having major problems of hunger, even starvation. There were people in Mississippi who had no income.
The next day, Senator Kennedy and Marian Wright toured the Mississippi Delta.
Doing pretty good. You want to go right in? We would just go from house to house and go in and talk to the people. These were very rural, very poor people, and walk through the house, talk to the inhabitants, go in the kitchen, look in the refrigerator, ask them what they ate the night before. And usually you would find awfully bare cupboards when you opened them.
What do you have for lunch?
We had lunch yet.
You haven't had lunch yet?
No.
If you're doing reasonably well, you don't run up against this kind of poverty. And certainly people elsewhere in the country have very little personal knowledge or information about it.
The need for solutions grew more pressing. After 3 summers of urban violence, many...
Okay, thank you. Well, we are privileged to have such a distinguished group of leaders joining us today. Let me briefly introduce them. Nick Kotz is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of 5 books. A former reporter for the Washington Post and the Des Moines Register. He wrote the 1970 book, Let Them Eat Promises, a critique of the politics of hunger in America. He used Kennedy's visit as a starting point to analyze efforts to reform anti-hunger programs. Marian Wright Edelman is the founder and president of the Children's Defense Fund. She's been an advocate for disadvantaged Americans for her entire professional life. After her graduation from Yale Law School, she began her career in the mid-1960s when, as the first black woman admitted to the Mississippi bar, she directed the NAACP Legal Defense Office in Jackson. She began the Children's Defense Fund in 1973 and has received numerous awards for her work, including the Presidential Medal of Freeman and the Robert F. Kennedy Lifetime Achievement Award for her writings. George Lapides was on the staff of the Memphis Press-Scimitar newspaper for 23 years. While there, he covered the riots at Ole Miss in 1962, regional state government and politics, and later helped direct the coverage of the Martin Luther King assassination. In 1967, he was promoted to sports editor, a position he held until the newspaper closed in 1983, and was later sports editor of the CBS TV affiliate until he retired in 2005. Owen Brooks grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and graduated from Northeastern University. In 1965, he joined the National Council of Churches and was assigned to the Delta Ministry in Greenville. As director, he spearheaded voter registration, education, and community and economic development projects. He recently retired as executive director of the Veterans of Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, but currently serves as an oral historian for the organization and the assistant oral historian for the Margaret Walker Center at Jackson State. Mr. James Figgs is a native of Marks, Mississippi. He was an activist with several groups during the Civil Rights Movement, including the NAACP and SNCC. He was educated at Mississippi Valley State University and the University of North Carolina. He's a former teacher and school board president. He's now the Director of Transportation for the Quitman County School District and currently serves as the Vice Mayor of Marks. So thank you all for being here. I'd like to start for just a moment, and I think I'd like to focus a little bit first on 1967, and then for the next round maybe we'll jump to 2012 and take a look at the ramifications there. But Mr. Kotz, I was wondering if you could talk to us about how hunger arose as a national issue and some of the political forces that were at work in the spring of 1967.
Ellen, I'm going to try to compress a lot of history in 6 minutes, and if I could talk as fast and eloquently as Marian does, I'd get it done.
Yeah.
1967, the war in Vietnam was raging, as we just heard, and the war in Vietnam was taking away what attention had been devoted to the war on poverty, the effort to follow up on the civil rights laws. The high point of the civil rights movement had passed. 1964 was the Civil Rights Act, which outlawed segregation in the South, called for equal employment opportunity, denied federal funds to anyone who discriminated. 1965 brought the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act enfranchised millions of African Americans in the southern states who had never been able to vote before. But by 1967, the steam had gone out of the civil rights movement. And indeed, there was a strong, powerful political reaction. It was a reaction in which many public officials, including the 2 senators from Mississippi, Eastland and Stennis, and a congressman by the name of Jamie Whitten, who has an institute at this university named after him, denied that there was any poverty. They denied that there was the hunger, which Ms. Edelman, by bringing those senators down here, at least briefly called some public attention to. Congressman Whitten not only denied that there was hunger, he sent FBI agents into the homes, the shacks in which poor Mississippi blacks lived, Mexican Americans, in Texas, others in Appalachia. That was part of a very concerted effort to avoid the issues which remained after those civil rights laws were passed. Martin Luther King put his finger right on it. He said the right to sit at a lunch counter was hard fought for and won. But that right means very little if you don't have the 25 cents to buy the hamburger. We were now trying to confront the issues that remain, and those were issues of poverty, lack of housing, lack of proper education, job training, and the most fundamental thing of all, lack of food. A small number of people decided that they would focus on this issue. If we couldn't solve jobs, we couldn't solve education, at the very least, there should not be hunger in this country. And I emphasize a small number of people. They listened to the voices in Texas and in Mississippi and in Appalachia. Marian Wright Edelman was one of the people who got the attention of powerful members of Congress. There were others. Following the visit of Robert Kennedy, thanks to the Field Foundation, a team of doctors was sent to Mississippi and to Appalachia and to Harlem. And those doctors confirmed that there were children who were starving and there was vast malnutrition. That's when Jamie Whitten from Mississippi sent the FBI agents out. The reaction of the Southern politicians and others was almost identical to their reaction when Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner disappeared. At that point, Senator Eastland said, "It's all a hoax. They're down in Cuba with their communist friends laughing at us." That's what the political situation was in Mississippi. Thanks to Robert Kennedy, because he could attract national attention, there was a brief moment of looking at the issue. And it was followed by these few other people. The Field Foundation sent the doctors in, and that got a little publicity. And that was followed by a National Commission on Hunger and Malnutrition, and that got a little publicity. And we can talk later about what the role of the press was. This is poverty in America, the issue of hunger in America has never been an issue which has commanded sustained attention by the press. There were a few exceptions to this, which we can talk about later. There was a CBS documentary. There was a fine story in the New York Times. And then there was nothing. But the people who really were interested in this issue, a few members of Congress, a few public organizations dedicated to trying to help the poor, kept trying to keep the issue on center stage. Robert Kennedy was killed, Martin Luther King was killed, President Nixon succeeded Lyndon Johnson, and the people who wanted to do something about this persisted. And it took until 1972 for Congress finally to enact a decent food stamp program, a better school lunch program, a program to help lactating mothers and their infant children. Today there are 32 million people that get food stamps, and there is a strong school lunch program. And really this story, which began with Robert Kennedy and Marian Edelman in Mississippi, continues. It has achieved a lot of problems remain.
Thank you. Mrs. Edelman, could you tell us a little bit about what you were seeing in Mississippi in 1967, and especially about some of the obstacles that poor people faced in Mississippi at the time?
Well, it's just a lot of poverty. There's a lot of hunger. There was a lot of malnutrition. There was starvation, which is a very serious charge to make. There's a lot of suffering. The Mississippi Summer Project had brought the press in large numbers to Mississippi because it was white children, middle-class children, and so that was a big story. But then they all left at the end of the summer, and I was left, and many of us were left. All the volunteers left, and I was left with hundreds of cases to settle, and was left with an awful lot of reaction to what had gone on in the Summer Project of 1964. And because of the voter registration drives and because of the push for equal rights, Mississippi was encouraging in every way they could people to leave. And many of them were so poor and illiterate that they couldn't even get the bus fare to go north, and they wouldn't have been able to read the street signs had they been able to get to the north. And the poverty program, the OEO poverty program, was enacted, and Head Start in 1965 was a light that some of us grabbed onto in the National Council of Churches Delta Ministry. The state turned it down. There was a single-purpose exception when the state did not take a program in the poverty, take Head Start, that private groups could apply for it, so we applied for it. The civil rights and church groups applied for it. And we had a big debate. Remember, a big debate with Bob Moses as to whether if we took federal money from the Head Start program, it would encourage dependence. On the other hand, I didn't know how else one could feed people. I mean, who was I to turn down, even though I haven't taken public money until now for 40 years, just to maintain my independence. But at any rate, we applied, the community groups, and it got funded, and it was one of the most wonderful community development projects ever. It created 3,000 new jobs, apart from the plantation and the state structure. Thousands of parents, I think we served 13,000 children, were for the first time aware of what their children could do. They saw textbooks that had children in them that looked like them. Parents were really able to go out and participate and get a new sense of hope for their children. It was a very exciting program. And Senator Stennis immediately understood, and Senator Eastland and Jamie Whitten, that this was a revolution, and it was. And they immediately began to attack it. And one of the advocacy lessons is, if you want to make sure that you're immune to attack, make sure your books are straight. And while we civil rights workers were, and they made all kinds of charges, 99% of them were not so. There was a full-fledged attack to get rid of Head Start, and the parents ran the center without refunding for 4 or 5 months. We eventually got refunded with Dr. King and everybody making a big effort, and Dick Boone, the Citizens Crusade Against Poverty. But poverty was continuing to grow, but Head Start was one light in all of that. And hunger was beginning to spread. There were no jobs. People were being pushed off the plantations who tried to vote. And by 1966, 67, it was a crisis, and the poverty program was under attack generally. Senator Stennis had told Sergeant Shriver that he didn't defund the Child Development Group of Mississippi, the local Head Start program. He was going to hold up the entire appropriations for the poverty program. But we fought back, and it was a struggle to refund. They tried to set up a middle-level group to assume Head Start programs in the state. At any rate, we fought back each time. And but the hunger continued to grow. 3,000 jobs was not enough. I got called up to Washington in March of 1967 to testify before the Senate subcommittee, Senator Clark's subcommittee, and to answer some of the attacks that Senator Stennis was continuing to make and Senator Eastland about the poverty program and how it was ineffective and misappropriating money. And I obviously defended it and defended Head Start, but I also then asked them to come and see for themselves. And happily, they came to see for themselves. And Robert Kennedy came and brought the press with him. First time I met Dan Shore from CBS News, who became a long-time friend. And Robert Kennedy was deeply moved, and he went back like a pit bull after he saw this and was moved by it and said he'd never seen, as you heard him say, anything like it in the United States. And went next day to see Orville Freeman, who did not even believe Robert Kennedy, that there were no people with income. Farm mechanization, chemical weed killers, a federal minimum wage for agricultural workers, the civil rights movement, all had set up a move to get people off the land and to get them out of the state. But we had to come back. Orville Freeman decided he would have to send back his own staff, and with my husband, which got me a husband out of this, the next day, calling up to say he was going to come back to go back and retrace the steps to prove to Orville Freeman that there were people with no income, and if they could prove that there were people with no income, perhaps he would consider lifting that $2 charge, which people could not pay as they moved from federal food commodities, which were free, over to food stamps. And so, but that did set into place a set of events, and Nick laid them out very well. And I think that all those folk are on food stamps today, even though lots of imperfections, but the only safety net we have with the virtual elimination of welfare reform is food stamps and WIC and school lunches. But we've got a long way to go, because how sad. There was a period when, with the panoply of laws and after the White House Conference on Hunger and the urban, Mr. Nixon did with Pat Moynihan, did a study in that period after he came in, and there was this strong continued bipartisan push after Robert Kennedy was assassinated and Dr. King was assassinated. In Congress with the McGovern Commission and Javits and all continued to push, and the outside public interest groups continued to push. And I think it's a case study about what it takes to bring about social change. You can have a demonstration, but it's the scut work. It's the stuff behind the scenes that you have to continue to be a really good pest. Good attitudes about being a really good pest and just not going away. And that resulted in a series of events that did eventually get the little bits of money that were put into getting the poor people out of town. You know, then to a demonstration project, which became WIC, and the school lunch things that became what we've got today, and the food stamps program, which is the safety net program that keeps hunger away. But hunger is back in America. I've just gone zigzagging across Mississippi. I've just been back in the Mississippi Delta, and it's just having to go to Baptist Hill in Greenwood. Just breaks my heart, and we just cannot go back there again. And it is time for the next movement, because the Poor People's Campaign was a watershed of trying to see how you could put the economic underpinnings beneath those civil and political rights so that people could really have dignity and move ahead. And we've got our job before us to finish what began then. So let's talk about that after.
Well, thank you. Yes, well, I want to hear more about that in just a few minutes. Mr. Lapides, you covered the whole visit for a Southern newspaper audience. Could you give us some of your impressions of the trip and what stands out most in your memory?
Yeah, but first I want to thank you for remembering or finding out that I've done something in my career other than sports. And I also want to tell Marian that I was there from the time it all started in Jackson through the journey into the Delta. When I saw the light come on between her and Senator Kennedy's legislative aide, Peter Edelman. don't mock me there. And I also had the privilege of listening to you speak. I think it was in 1993 at the commencement at the University of Texas, where I had a son who was graduating. I'd like to sort of set the scene for what took place, because there were a number of other senators involved in all of this besides Robert Kennedy. We had a couple of days of hearings in Jackson, Mississippi, and Senator Javits, also from New York, was there. Senator Winston Prouty and Gaylord Nelson, and George Murphy, the tap dancer from California, was a senator, and he was there. And Joe Clark, who I think was very important, was there. And only of that group, the only ones who went with us into the Delta were Senators Clark and Senators Kennedy, and Marian was our guide. And
Amsley Moore.
And that's right. That's correct. That's correct. And I saw things when we were on that tour that woke me up a whole lot. And I will never forget an experience where I think we were in some ramshackle houses in Bolivar County. And we were flying on a very small plane, a Martin 404, I believe, and the three networks were there: ABC, NBC, CBS. There was no Fox, thank heavens. And not only that, Not only that, there were, I think, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Bill Miner from the New Orleans Times-Picayune, and Meek. And I think that was it. And I spent 2 nights out by the swimming pool at the Downtowner just talking with Senator Kennedy about everything, including the downfall, because he was more interested in them than I was at the time, of the New York Yankees, who at the time were owned by CBS and wrecked them. But at any rate, there's one experience that I'll never forget, and Marian led Senator Kennedy, and I was walking behind him up to somebody's door, knocked on the door, and you stepped aside, and Senator Kennedy was left standing there, and a man and his wife, elderly, answered the door, and their eyes got about this big. And I may have the names wrong, but the man said, why you're Mr. Bobby Kennedy. And Senator Kennedy looked at him and said, and you're Mr., and I would have sworn he said Sam Houston Smith, but in reading my own articles that Ellen sent me, I think he said Andrew Jackson Smith. So I don't want to misquote myself here. It was a very enlightening trip, and even though there was very limited coverage because there wasn't room on that plane, it got an unbelievable amount of national attention. I did see Senator Kennedy walk out the back door of one of these, I don't want to call them houses, they were shacks, and walk out the back door and go to the next house and walk in the back door of that house. And nobody else, I don't think, saw it. And I did. And we had to have pool reporters go into each shack because they were so small. And so curiosity got the best of me, and I walked over to that other shack and opened the door, and I saw Senator Kennedy, who was dressed in a beautiful pinstripe charcoal gray suit, sitting on a filthy floor, dirt floor, with a child about 18 months old with a distended stomach. And he was sitting on, Senator Kennedy had him sitting on his lap, and tears were coming down Senator Kennedy's eyes. I didn't write about it. I thought it was a very private moment. And I only wrote about it in an op-ed column the day after Senator Kennedy was murdered. But anybody who was on that trip, I can tell you, it changed their lives. Did I answer your question?
Excellent, thank you. Well, Mr. Brooks, you brought a slightly different perspective because you weren't not a native of the region and you were working with part of a ministry supported by a national organization. Could you tell us a bit about what you were focused on then, and maybe when you heard about Kennedy's tour, did you think it would have an impact on what you were trying to accomplish there?
Well, let me begin by saying, first of all, I at an early age learned to follow the leader. I was not the leader, I was the follower. And at that time, I worked for AMSI and was glad to, okay? And we were doing a lot of things, and some of them weren't quite so successful. But we sat in the air base because of hunger. We had a state conference on poverty at Mount Beulah in Edwards, Mississippi. And as a result of that conference, you know, we came back to the Delta, and we said we got to have some kind of demonstration, and the poor people were willing to, at that point, take over the air base. That's what we did. And that made the front page of the Times. I never will forget. And that was just one flag that went up there. The other thing I'd like to highlight is children. I had been there for 2 years, and I was able to recognize children at the Greyhound bus station when school was out, and they were headed north. And I would always say, they would always say to me, and I'd say to myself, some of those children never coming back. And indeed, they had to go somewhere else to get a better chance at life. So we didn't stem the tide of out-migration as far as poor people were concerned. And these were black and white children, you know, because there are more white poor children than there are black, simply because we're outnumbered, right? So that was real, and that you could witness that and see that. And I would say that the Meredith March in '66 also revealed, to a point, some of the conditions that were prevailed in the area. It wasn't just about voter registration, sure it was, but we made sure that we went into other areas off of the march, right, and took testimony about what was going on in primarily the Mississippi Delta. That was a shock for me. The Delta was a shock. I came from Boston, like you said, and I'm not used to it. That's not true, okay? Because anybody with a heart and with some eyes can witness poverty for what it is. And I'll tell you a story. There was a Presbyterian minister that pastored in Cleveland. I've been telling this story a long time. And we tried to, the Northern Presbyterian Church, they were split into the Northern and the Southern wing of the Presbyterian Church. And the Northern Presbyterian people said, well, we have a church in Cleveland, and we're sending a delegation from both churches to talk to the pastor of that church. And indeed, they invited him to my house on Church Street in Cleveland on a Sunday afternoon. So we, Amzie and myself, and the church dignitaries, so to speak, they were there waiting for the pastor to come. And the pastor didn't come. And somebody thought let's contact this man and see why he doesn't come and meet his peers. And he had the gall to say he couldn't find a way to my house. Now my rejoinder to that was, well, he passes my house every evening bringing the maid home. So I don't know all of a sudden, you know, that he can't find my house in Cleveland. And, well, with things like that. And we had been doing, all sorts we made all sorts of efforts, okay, to bring the spotlight on the conditions in the Delta, and Marian shared a lot of them with you. But yes, this was a bad time. And I would, if I'm not jumping the gun, I would say, like I said to people very recently, hunger never completely left the Delta, okay? And hunger has a resurgence in Mississippi. And we have more children per capita that are hungry and homeless in that state today that need to be attended to.
Thank you so much. And I hope we can come back and talk more about that. Mr. Figgis, you grew up in Mississippi, and you were very familiar with the conditions that Kennedy encountered. From your perspective, both as a resident and an activist, what did you think was the significance of the visit?
Thank you very much for being here. And it's a pleasure to be with these other persons on the platform. We talk about poverty, something I'm very familiar with. And they had a thing to expose the conditions of our community and counties that it called Poor People's Campaign. I know you're familiar with it. Well, see, I was poor, not poor. There's a difference. In the shacks you talked about, I lived in one of those shacks. And I was inspired by my late mentor, Aaron Henry, who had been an activist all in his professional life. Matter of fact, he sacrificed a pharmacy to get involved in doing for people who couldn't do for themselves. It inspired me when my mother, who took me to Emmett Till's trial. And then came the 400 civil rights workers from all over the country. Former governor of California, Gerald Brown, Senator Joe Lieberman, Diggs, Alan Clayton Powell, came to the aid of those of us that was in poverty. You have to understand, those of us that was poor and poor didn't have no representation. You couldn't hold an intelligent conversation with anyone across the track. Some of y'all are old enough to know what cross the track means. So you had a beautiful young lady in her primes, saw fit to come to Mississippi and give some guidance to us. Ms. Wright. And I'm talking about information that was strict, supportive, and all the contact that she had to bring gentlemen like this in. Outspoken, stood firm for what was right for people. As Ms. Wright went through her presentation, I went, my brother said I'm weak because I cry. But when you have witnessed something for yourself, you don't cry for sadness, you cry for joy. She was able to have an impact. And she explained, I hope you young people really followed what she was saying. She walked you through the whole 9 yards. You kept bringing on support groups, Delta Ministry, National Civil Rights groups, welfare reform, legal defense, legal services. And from every front, we needed that help. I got inspired to go one-on-one, go to churches and groups, to risk our lives. As a matter of fact, me and several others in the Delta, my mother wore an apron. She was up at 4, gone to the master's house to fit his food, and get his kids ready to go to school. And left us there. So we were glad to have individuals such as these to come in and expose what we already knew. We had to slip out the house. You had to slip and talk one-on-one. Because you knew if you pulled into an individual advocating what was right, you might not make it home. You might not make it home. You had to come out and send a dummy car ahead of you. And you had to walk 4 or 5 miles in the backwoods and catch them at the other end. Because you knew somebody that was there already gave a call or went and told those who didn't want us to be there. And before we went, Mr. Brooks, you can witness, you was right. Before we went in any community, the wrong people knew that we were coming. So they were prepared. I never forget one night in Natchez, Mississippi. It was in 63. I am drawing Social Security, so excuse me if I think of it. Highway Patrol was our worst enemies. Because I got more whoopings by Highway Patrol than I got by my mama. I know she whooped me in the wrong place at the wrong time. Highway Patrol called us. Said, you don't want to go back to Jackson, Mississippi that way. Now this is a Highway Patrol. Wasn't no African Highway Patrol, but 40 years later. He called because he had a sensitive. He didn't want to see Aaron Henry dead. There had been an award put out for Aaron. I traveled with Aaron as a young lad all the way until he became ill. they had set up to do us no good. So we got an opportunity to experience these things. But things that were workable, that would improve, that Ms. Wright and the Delta ministry had, was significant to us because they were teaching us how to be dependent, how to be firm, how to stand for what's right. And I can say this with my hand on the Bible. I have never hated doing this struggle in this fight. I've never hated because of the two races. I hated the wrongdoing that was being done. But I never hated. Because if I had hated, you've never been able to make any movement. Because Dr. King told us in Selma that if you participated and you hated, you were missing the purpose, your concentration. How can you concentrate when you're involved in all this hate? And I thank these journalists for following us and getting the word out and telling the naked truth. Because nobody in my community would print that the kids on 5th Street were starving and that the family that was put off the plantation because they dared to go talk about registry had no assistance. They'd been rolled in off the plantation, put in these shacks that had been abandoned by those who went to Chicago and New York. So I've been blessed. And I try to teach my grand and great-grands when I see the sagging pants. I call Bubba, one of my babies, and I explain to him how he hurt me for the role that the granddaddy played and others, that you don't show up like that. You better than that. And I keep a picture of Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass. I keep a picture of them in my living room. I walk them through them guys. The first line, first defense. And I got a plaque that I have my granddaughter, who's now a senior at Jackson State, to visit sometime. Article 15, I know the lawyer know about it, in South Carolina was issued after freedom of the slaves, about the 40 and the mule. So you got to continue to be smart and learn and obtain what you need to know in order to get that 40 that I didn't get in that mule. You have to stay concentrated at all times.
Yes, sir.
Now, it's not over in the ACP. We preached that. And I joined the SNCC because they were old folks too slow. They were old folks and too slow. I wanted to move. But when I got in jail, Aaron Henry, the NACP, was there to get me out of jail, to keep me from going down the river. So I got beat up, thrown in jail, and was a candidate for the hangman noose 4 days the next morning. But thank God for Aaron Henry and Mel Leventhal that showed up with the FBI at the front door of the jail and asked the question, where is it? And the jail said, he's not here. And Aaron said, yes, he's here. Because we've been having somebody shop around this jail all night. And I was in a dungeon in the back. So I'm grateful for God blessing me to be able to live through it, be a part of it. And I wanted to quit, like you said, got kind of rough there in the 60s. And when I look at my community, it scares me. And I'm going to stop now.
Well, I want to get...
I tell you, when you tell a civil rights activist, he got 2 or 3 minutes.
Well, I think that several of the panelists have brought up an interesting point, and I thought Mr. Kotz, you could talk to us a little bit about coverage of poverty now. And if we shift to 2012, why don't we see more of it? We seem to see some statistics, you know, data, stories, but not the kind of moving depictions that maybe we saw then.
Ellen, listening to Mr. Figgs, Mr. Brooks, and Ms. Edelman shows the opportunity that is there and has always been there for journalists who want to tell this story and who will argue with editors long enough to get the story in the paper and on the air. The history of American journalism, stated kindly, was described by Walter Lippmann, who was a great columnist, but he was also a student and philosopher about the press. He says the press operates as a moving spotlight. It's there, and then it moves on to there, to there, to there. And it doesn't stay on any story. That's true in general, but in particular with issues of poverty in America. The coverage of those issues only comes very rarely led by a political figure. Why? Because this is not a popular subject. The majority of Americans do not want to hear about it. Newspaper editors and assignment editors cover what politicians want to talk about. Therefore, there is a huge opportunity for you young people who are going into journalism to pick out the most difficult stories that involve the most fundamental values of this country and struggle and get those stories told. The challenge is there today. President Obama, who I admire, does not talk about poverty. President Clinton, who I admired, did not talk about poverty. And these folks can tell you about today and that what exists today and the opportunities, the privilege that we have as journalists to cover those stories.
Yes, well, thank you. And I think it's important, I know for my students, I wanted to emphasize that all of you all were in your 20s and just not too far from where these students are today, and when you were working so hard and making a difference and writing and continued on with that. But Ms. Edelman, could you talk to us? Many children today, both in the Delta and the nation, are in crisis. Would you talk a little bit about what you see and how it relates to what was going on in '67? Maybe some opportunities for press coverage? Or...
Well, I hope that some journalism students or journalists will go back out and knock on some of these doors. And I've been zigzagging across Mississippi the last 3 days, in fact, the last 7 days. And I'd love to go on a child watch with you, and you will see hunger all over the Mississippi Delta, homelessness all over, the most squalid living conditions all over, the listlessness of black men standing in clumps of people all day because they've got no jobs. I went back to the old SNCC office, which is falling down, and talked to the man who was living in there in the little garden on the side. But I looked at all those shotgun houses that used to be across there, full of mud as the front yard, and you could see through them. It's horrible. And anybody who wants to go on a child watch with me and others in the Mississippi Delta, I would be glad to take you. I want you to go. I went to Walnut Grove, and I went to Parchment this morning. Prison and incarceration has become the new American apartheid. 1 in 3 black boys born in 2001, 1 in 6 Latino boys born in 2001 are at risk of going to jail. And the feeder systems, all of which we tried to change, at least the legal barriers, or the lack of early childhood education. Head Start is the one good thing that's still out here. It's still reaching only about a quarter of the children who need it. We're still struggling to get an early childhood, high quality early childhood system because we know it pays and we know about brain development and how that's going to be the biggest thing to prevent dropout prevention and to build strong citizens, and we're still as dumb as we can be. We're spending twice as much on prisons in Mississippi. Most states are spending on average 3 times more per prisoner than for public school pupil. That's really dumb, folk. And it's time for you all to stand up and say this is really dumb, and to vote it, and to protest, and to just raise a ruckus. The schools, 80% of black children, 80% of black children, let me just say in Mississippi, over 75% of all of your children cannot read, of all races and all income groups, cannot read a computer grade level in 4th, 8th, or 12th grade. And over 80% of black children in this state and nationally cannot read or compute at grade level. What is a child going to do if they can't read and compute in this globalizing economy? They're being sentenced to social and economic death. And how are you going to get industry to come in this delta? Even the catfish ponds are being competed with now by China. If you can't read, you don't have an educated populace. The chief national security issue in this nation comes from nobody from the outside. It comes from our failure to invest in all of our children before they get sick and drop out of school, failure to educate them, to give them health care, to get jobs and jobs and jobs, to give hope. And so the crisis is as severe and extraordinary today as it was then. We've got the legal rights. You've got more black elected officials, but the influence and the power is not there. And you have got to begin to be the voice to push those politicians. Politicians don't lead, they follow, as we just heard. And now the media also has changed. Let me just say, I just tell you how much I miss the intelligent, mostly Southern reporters, the Kotz whom I saw standing up in the Greenville mob and didn't recognize me, but the John Herbers, the Eugene Pattersons, the folk, the Ralph McGills, the folk who knew the actors, knew the context, and were really intelligent about what was happening. Intelligent. Now you got narrow casting. You could show the same police dogs and the same fire hoses on 3 networks. Now, my Lord, with 2 seconds, you can't get a message across on anything with narrow casting, and it's all about entertainment, and it's all about whatever. But we have somehow got to get back to serious journalism. You cannot have a democracy without the truth and without information. And the journalistic profession, just like the rest of us who are teaching, have got to begin to say, what is our purpose in our professions? What is our purpose in life? And so I just hope that we can get good teachers who will put children first, because it's about adult interests. We have adults who have gone AWOL, and children have become beside the point, but it is our moral and economic Achilles heel. If we don't invest in our children, we're absolutely, as Dr. King warned us on his last title to his mama on the day he was assassinated, America's gonna go to hell. We have got to deal with poverty. We've got to deal with the justice issues, and we've got to save our children in order to save ourselves. So you got a job cut out for you. It's a very exciting time.
Well, we are running a little tight on time. I wanted to maybe offer a chance to have a couple of questions from the audience, if possible. I think he's got a microphone.
Yeah, Ellen.
Yes, yes. Go ahead, please.
Curtis Wilkie over here. It was and is a phenomenal journalist. Yes. And I hope the people here who are particularly journalism students realize that. I also would like to tell the journalism students, I know that you asked me earlier that I wrote for a Southern audience. I was lucky. The only editors I ever had told me to write what I saw. And I sort of agree with you. I think some of the Southern journalists, including Harrison Salisbury, the New York Times, and others, were among the best, and I certainly include Curtis in that bunch. And I would advise your journalism students, newspapers, as bad a shape as they're in, still where it's at. I counted on local TV the other night, the NBC affiliate, 6 straight stories on crime, and they were meaningless stories. I mean, they were hit and runs and all that, and nothing in depth, nothing about poverty, nothing about needs, and it makes me sick. And I hope you young people do something about that.
We have some, Craig has a microphone back there. We have somebody who has a question for anyone? Sure. He's going to bring you a microphone. Another one? Okay. Or what's either one?
Oh.
Okay.
First of all, I think you all are all extraordinary speakers, and we really needed this. But this is especially for Mrs. Edelman. Do you think the responsibility of improving communities is constituted more on the development of journalists, or do you think it's also through sociology, the political aspect of it? Because journalists, we can only do so much. I mean, like, when you're making people angry, you're doing your job, but don't you think the responsibility is also, you know, really in the hands of sociologists? And
you know, the responsibility is in the hands of all of us. I mean, you know, you get this crazy debate that's going on now about all these illiterate children that we're producing in our public school systems funded by public money. And some say it's the teachers in the schools, some say it's poverty in the community, and some say it's parents. It's all of these things. I mean, children don't come in pieces. They grow up in families, and what goes on in those families affects everything in many ways about that child, but families don't come in pieces either. They depend on the jobs that are available in their community. Parents need to do their job, and don't be a parent if you're not going to stay with those children for all of your lives. And family life has broken down. The socializing institutions in this country of all races and all income groups, I think, have been dramatically weakened, but in the poor community and the black community without jobs, the structural change in the economy, and with the cultural changes and the corrosive culture. I mean, what comes through the internet and what comes through the television set is unbelievable. I mean, but, you know, there were negative messages when I was growing up, and all of us were growing up. As a little black girl in South Carolina, I was told I wasn't worth anything, but I didn't believe it because my mom and daddy said it wasn't so. My church folks said it wasn't so. My teacher said it wasn't so, so I knew it wasn't so. But those buffers have been eliminated in many ways, and the church is no longer the church, and I won't get onto that. I won't go into that. The church needs to become the church again, and the folk need to live their faith, and they need to open up those doors and put freedom schools in there so that they can have a place for children to go and have a constructive alternative to the streets and the television. But families have to speak up, but we have to empower families. Parents can't teach what they don't know. And if you're 15 and 16 and you're in a second generation family of single parents and you've got all loads of them in the Delta and 65% of them are poor, you know, so parents have to make a difference. We have to help them make that difference. The schools need to teach, and we need to get bad teachers and bad educators out. We need to watch this charter school legislation and make sure that it doesn't be a back door now for resegregating already resegregated schools. We need to pay attention to what is going on in the education system, and that's in all of our interest to do that. And we ought to encourage more people to go in education. I'm trying to keep everybody out of law school and say, y'all go teach. We've got to deal with the economy, we've got to deal with politicians and hold them accountable. You've got to pay attention to redistricting, run for the school board, run for public office, and when you run for public office, don't forget it's not about you. Amen. It's about the community. It's about building a better life for the next generation, and we're using up the feed corn because of our adult selfishness, so all of us have to play a role. And you know, your job as a journalist is to go out and find the truth and to tell the truth. Okay, and to report and give voice to the voiceless. I mean, children have no voice and they can't lobby, so the point is, how do we, who are adults, take on that responsibility? And so it's all of us, but each of us takes our piece and try to get out of our silos by focusing in on how do we make sure that this country becomes more just, and the absolutely obscene poverty and extreme poverty, which is growing in this country at a time when the beyond obscene wealth at the top, and this income gap between rich and poor is wider than there's ever been recorded. Speak up, yell, get back out in the streets and say this is not the American way. So I just think that I can't reinforce enough to go out and just see and talk and hear, and we've all got to do our part to give people hope and to give people a sense that justice is possible.
Okay, we have one right here.
I might have a good follow-up question. As a professor of political science, interloping here in the journalism school, I teach a course on international development, and I'm always shocked when I ask my students, okay, of all these development models, what can we do to improve the situation in Mississippi? And they say, well, I don't know. And I said, well, what can we do to help the Delta? And they say, well, I've never been to the Delta. So I've started requiring them to go and do a service learning project in the Delta. But I often struggle with how to balance the frustrations and negative self-perception that people have about Mississippi with the desire to do good. So how do we keep Mississippi from being down on itself when we look in the dark corners and see the things that aren't perfect about Mississippi, while also building up in the areas where we need to build up?
Can I just respond very briefly to that? There are wonderful things going on all over Mississippi run by wonderful people. I have been, and there are good best practices all over this state, all over the South, in every community. You're going to find people who are doing the right thing, who are reaching out on a one-on-one basis, who are trying to do that freedom school, who really are trying to, be that hand and that safety net for children. And there are wonderful examples, and when you go on a child watch, you should see what's wrong, but then you should be taken to what's right. And there are a lot of things that are going on what's right. And I have just been re-humbled all over again in the last week when I look back at where we have come over a 50-year period through a civil rights movement that was forged by people who had almost no resources, that were poor. When I look back, I mean, I saw Amity Moore. I went to Amity Moore's Park, and I tell you, to be able to walk in Cleveland, Mississippi, and to see that big, wonderful park, and to go to Miss Hamer's grave, and to think about what Miss Hamer went through and what changes she brought, and to go back to Miss Maybertha Carter's Drew this morning on the way here, and to think about what she did in challenging and throwing out freedom of choice, sham freedom of choice, in order for her 7 youngest children to be able to get an education, all 7 of them with misery, stuck it out, finished high school, went to Ole Miss in Mississippi State, Mississippi Southern, became professionals, and then one generation afterwards, somebody, Connie Curry, and her wonderful thing called me up to say Miss Maybertha's grandson is in Parchment Prison. I said, Miss Maybertha's grandson can't be in Parchment Prison. But Drew and the drugs and the underground economy, because there are no jobs, but they are extraordinary people who brought about extraordinary changes, and it's re-inspiring. If they could do what they did with so little and with the conviction that they wanted to build a better life for their children, you've got such a rich history here of efficacy, of commitment, of unbelievable courage, that I just think that you should go and affirm that. And I think that any child watches that are planned for journalism students should take you down the freedom trails and affirm all the great people who are doing great things then and now. And so there's always hope. It depends on leadership, and it's all available to all of us to step up to the plate and exercise.
Before we take another question, I did want to, Mr. Because you are still in Marks, still living there. You're the one person here who's been there all along. Could you just tell us just a little bit about what you see and what stories you think could be covered? What needs some attention?
Thank you. I wonder sometimes I wonder, baffled the fact that why did I stay? And all of my friends that was involved, New York, law school graduate, DC, liquor stores in Chicago, they had plenty of money. Why did I stay? I think I stayed because in all of my involvement, I was closely knitted in the church. And I had a mother that was close knit in the church. If you grew up committing yourself to making a sacrifice for something that you truly believe in, and then your biblical background reinforced that when you appear for your services in church, it reinforces you. And she said, yeah, there's poverty in Mississippi, abundant of poverty in the Delta. And when I go where Dr. King cried, did you visit today. And I was with him. He had the same experience that Robert Kennedy had. A year later, he went to visit a home that was about half a block because it had rained. In the delta, all the water flowed to us. Y'all need to keep some of the water up here. It floods us. And this lady, he had visited other homes, as you saw today, they ain't there. We saw we had trailers there. And he saw this lady on the porch with 2 little kids. And he said, Jose, we need to get out there. And we got the boat, he went out there. He didn't make it in the house. They was on the porch, 2 kids on the porch, and you had 3 in the house. The baby was in a tub used as a baby bed with cotton sacks on it, belly swole up bigger than a head. He grabbed her too. He said, wait a minute. And he shed tears right there and then. He didn't catch himself. That might be one of the reasons I'm still there. I'm 69 years old. I got involved, I was 15. I've been able to acquire the necessary resources to provide an education for my family. And that's all you really want to do. So I was able to do that and stay there. They all been gone, I want to go away. But I got grands and great-grands there. So I stay. And my friends tell me all the time when they come visit, because they got away from that. Oh yeah, being successful, you got to be able to obtain that, but still keep your moral values and keep your sensitivity for them you left there. And they tell me you're crazy you stay here. But I've been crazy there 69 years. And I'm all right. And you know what? Kids of a different race speak and appreciate me because before their fathers died, they told them, well, you know that old James Fig wasn't so bad after. You got to be elected first black this. He came in, we thought he was going to destroy the school board. He was going to destroy the city council. But he worked to accomplish something for his people. If you got a street on this side of the track, I'm going to jump on that table till you put one on that side of the track. They're going to go together. Nothing wrong with supporting those who support you. And I stay there because it ain't time to leave, Miss Wright. God bless you, come back. Brooke stayed. This old...
Easy now. Easy.
I could go in a meeting with him, a mass meeting. And I go in, we here, we united. And he gets so fired up, I'll be ready to fight right then on the issues because he was so dedicated. My problem today is the house in the area that Dr. King visit and all the money that's been in my community. We just tore that shack down because it fell almost to the ground. We just tore it down. Nothing has been done in that area. Nobody paid attention. But you got money to redo downtown. You got money to redo the city hall. You got money to redo everything that needed done. But the priority should have been in that area where it brought Dr. King to his tears. We missed the boat. We just missed the boat.
Well, I'm so sorry we're out of time. I can't thank you all enough. You've just given us such a wonderful perspective, and I know the rest of you enjoyed it as well. Thank you.